The title of the project that I'm going to be presenting at Los Angeles State Historic Park is Their Body Became. My art practice has been a huge part of my healing from intergenerational trauma, from events that have occurred throughout my life, specifically the suicide of my mother, and also helping me to rewrite those stories and to understand them in a different way. So in 2019, the story of my mother's suicide just really shifted, and through some of my own practices and work. And I began to think about what would happen if I thought about her actions not as an act of abandonment or an act of violence, which it had it was a violent death, but as a gift. As what I really feel like that's how I believe she thought of it as. So I started to craft this narrative around the idea of her being a saint, and sort of looking at early Christian mysticism and thinking about the stories of early saints and how they were really tortured people a lot of the time that were meant to provide some sort of solace to other people through their example. I grew up with my mother, but also with my grandmother, with having a lot of contact with my grandmother. And my grandmother had a set of embodied spiritual practices that aren't necessarily really common in American Catholicism, but they have links and a history that goes back to Sicily, which is where my family's from. And these practices involved speaking in tongues and being slain in the spirit and having these mystical experiences that my mother became really kind of obsessed with this idea that we had this family legacy of mental illness, this family history of bipolar disorder. And my mother made family trees that talked about this history of, charting who had bipolar disorder that she believed in our family. My grandmother had a belief that we had a history of spiritual gifts. I was interested in that as a way of reframing narratives around mental illness and reframing even like who we venerate. There's a social context for how we understand behavior. So right now we understand behavior, certain types of behavior, as being linked to mental illness because of our belief in the medical industrial complex and the psychiatric industrial complex. But at a different period of time, there was a social context around that behavior being a spiritual gift or being part of a system of veneration. When I first was attracted to working with bees, I was really thinking about them in relation to materials and process, because that's what drives my work. So I was thinking about beeswax, I was thinking about honey, I was thinking about a bee colony as a family, as a nuclear family, which is what it is. But I didn't know enough about bees to have the relationship I have with them now. So when I began researching them more and coming to understand them, what I learned is that feral bee colonies, the way that they reproduce is that the queen, who's the mother to all the bees, when she's getting ready to create a new queen, she creates this new daughter queen and then prepares to leave the hive. And she actually leaves the hive and takes half the colony with her and then goes off to create a new hive somewhere else. And a lot of the time, that's actually a suicide mission. 75% of the time, that colony doesn't actually reestablish themselves. They might never find a place to start a new hive. They might start a new hive in somebody's backyard, in a place where somebody doesn't want bees. And so actually, this act that seems like an act of abandonment, or it's, could be interpreted that way, is also an act of giving life. It's an act of passing down this hive to the next generation. So bees became an allegory for me to talk about the same story I was crafting about my mother being a saint and my mother's death being an act of giving life. after beginning to work with feral bees, starting this ongoing collaboration with feral bees, I wrote a text called Hail Holy Queen, a Novena to the Bees. And that was taking the format of a novena, which is a Catholic prayer, an appeal to a saint for intercession for somebody who's died, somebody whose soul is in limbo, basically. And this is something that after my mother died, my grandmother would tell me. You have to pray for your mother. The people who've died, they can pray for us, but they can't pray for themselves. She never called it a novena, but that's what she meant. My installation at Los Angeles State Historic Park has a few different components. The first part that the viewer will probably encounter are these fired ceramic objects, which are prayer receptacles. So they have a slit at the top, and you can put messages into them, wishes or prayers or any sort of message in response to the text on them. And the text is sort of about becoming or emerging or releasing things that no longer serve you. Moving on from those, there's going to be an installation on the top of one of the mounds in the park that is an empty shrine. And so it's sort of like you might see a backyard grotto with an icon or the Virgin Mary installed in it, but instead this one is going to be empty, and the interior is going to be modeled like a cave in Griffith Park where these feral bee colonies make their home. And surrounding that empty shrine is a tapestry where I've written text from my poem, Hail Holy Queen, a Novena to the Bees, that describes the relationship of the queen leaving as an act of giving life to the new generation. I've been thinking a lot about how I can use the process to create some closure around the story of my mother, and to evolve beyond that and move past it in different ways. And through the use of process and materials, thinking about how the shrine is going to be constructed out of an adobe mixture that has, clay and sand and also dirt. And I'm going to, in the adobe mixture, include the ashes of my mother, so that this installation that I'm creating is both a way of literally and metaphorically burying her, and creating a sense of closure. Through the process of making this work, I've also begun to question what happens when you continue to make work about a trauma if the work doesn't also evolve. And I believe that needs to happen, so that's part of the process of growth. And for me, what that means is bringing in queer narratives and bringing in more information that makes me the central character, and not always my mother, because otherwise that's just, it's maybe reproducing the trauma.
Gonna try new teeth.
So part of my experience growing up with someone who had such intense desires as my mother was really that she dominated the emotional space in the house, and there wasn't room necessarily for me to have a formation of my identity. So I think that there are ways in which this work is meant to be not just a space for me to explore that, but also create space for other people to do that.